we've done research on what we call our Christmas tree schools, which are schools that are just taking any new program and saying yes to everything, and then they end up being, not very coherent places for teaching and learning. So we have to be really cognizant of that too, that we don't want to do anything that's going to interfere, and that what we learn is really going to add value to those schools.
So now let's say we've got past that, you've got buy-in, we've done this research. Obviously, you're going to need access to a lot of student data to see the results, whether attendance data, grades, testing. How does the consortium work with CPS to get access to that data in a way that gives you that kind of robust data, but still is important for the student privacy and security?
Yeah, well, I'll say that data is really important because that allows us to do really high-quality work because we can look at changes over time. We have this database that has records of students and teachers and schools going back to the 1990s. We have a data sharing agreement with the Chicago Public Schools that is, has lots of very clear stipulations. We take data security very, very seriously. So, there are requirements in terms of how we store data, how we get data. We don't keep data with identifiable information. The researchers don't have access to that. But all the files are securely stored. Only people who need access get access, and then everyone has to go through annual training and certification. And then we have our IT department that are looking over the uses of the data. If they're monitoring our server, people can only use data that are on the server through laptops that have been checked out in terms of their security. Then we also, there are, all kinds of stipulations about, not releasing findings, not releasing data without the district seeing it first. And when they're looking, so, first, that's really important to the data, to the partnership, that the district always sees our findings before it's released publicly. They can't keep us from releasing findings, because that's important for our independence. But they have to be able to look at it. And, from our perspective, that's the time when they can actually work the best and figure out what to do when they're not under the microscope, right? So it's, in terms of support for practice and improving practice, that's really important. But it's also important that they have eyes because they also want to make sure that we're not going to be putting out any identifiable information or breaking any of their policies about what comes out, so that we're not harming, we're not risking anyone's confidentiality, either child, adult, or school community.
So it seems to me that consistency is probably a really big strength for the consortium, because I know out in Boston, when we would work with a new researcher, they'd have to go through a whole process each time, signing the NDAs and working with IT to get access to the data, and then trying to figure out what data they wanted. And it just took a long time to get the research off the ground. It sounds like with the consortium, that's a quicker process. And when you are approved for a study and you get the results, people are already very comfortable with the processes and the data and the formats and everything.
Yeah, having it all set out. And we already have the data, right? It's just sitting there. We just need permission to use the data, to answer specific research questions. So then once we get the permission, then the data are there and we can start, and we have, the data are documented, and there are people who've been using the data, at the consortium who can, provide advice and guidance on the data sets, because, administrative data sets, it's a lot to wrangle, and the data changes over time. There are always quirks and issues, and so you've just always got to keep track of all those things, and figure out the best ways to use the data. What can you use that you're going to trust, and how much do you trust those data?
Yeah, and it's just small administrative side note. When I worked with the data in Boston, we the database always showed the active students alphabetically. So there was this one family whose last name was really high up in the alphabet. And so there was kind of a joke around central office because this family was always the first one you would see. And then one day a new student came in and their last name had 3 A's to start with. And everyone was like, there is a new champion in the city of Boston. And then I decided to look into it, and it turns out it's just a typo. It was too many A's. The number one family in Boston was not dethroned, and everything was back to normal. But that's a fun administrative data core.
Yeah.
Great. So now, y'all have access to the data. Y'all have got the buy-in. Do you usually use the data that's already kind of the results that are already in, or do you ever design surveys or collect new metrics to measure results?
Yeah, actually, I feel like that's one area where we've had huge impact is figuring out ways to measure things that people don't have measures for. So, as I said, we developed these surveys starting in the 1990s to measure the 5 essential supports. We are constantly revising those surveys. So now the surveys are given annually in the district to all teachers and to students in grades 4 through 12. And every year, we take a step back and we say, are there things that we want to take out of the survey? Are there new things that we should be developing measures for, that we should be, new kinds of questions we want to ask? And it's always this kind of balancing game. There's so many things that people want to know and new questions to add, but you want to have consistency over time because that's how whether new policies and programs are having an effect, is to look at that change over time and to have that consistency. But then, of course, things change. Practices change, people's perspectives change. So sometimes measures that or questions that were really relevant 10 years ago are not so relevant today. So always trying to look to see, how do we make sure we're going to get the most information that's currently relevant with the most consistency with the fewest number of questions, because long surveys make for, survey attrition. So that's one thing. So we're constantly working on the surveys, but then we also, anything that we don't have measures for that people think are important, we need to get measurement for. We need to figure out ways to measure them. So, for example, back in when I first started working at the consortium, there were no measures of how students were doing in college, or if students were even going to college. So we had high schools preparing students for college with no idea whether their students actually went to college. So that was a line of research to work with Chicago Public Schools to figure out how to use National Student Clearinghouse data to actually track students into post-secondary and through college. And now everyone uses those methods, right? But that took a lot of time to figure out how do we actually use those data, and and working with the National Student Clearinghouse as well. There were no measures of how students were doing their freshman year of high school. So everyone, all the measures of high schools were at the end, like high school graduation rates, ACT scores, right? But our research had suggested the 9th grade year was critically important. So developing, these measures of freshman on track to understand how students are doing the freshman year.
And so in this study, when you looked at how school leaders and principals influence student achievement, what were the kind of variables you measured that were inputs, and what were the outcome variables that you measured?
Oh, right. So we started with principal leadership and how teachers perceive principals in their school. And then we looked at things like teacher influence and teacher leadership. And we wanted to know how, principals as leaders influence different aspects of school organization. So, the climate, was it safe, orderly? So we looked at how, the different kind of aspects of school organization. And we did, some initial analyses just to see if we could cluster different aspects of school organization together, just to kind of wrangle the data a little bit. And so different things came out, the school climate, did students and teachers feel safe? Were there high expectations for students? The supports for teaching, such as professional learning and program coherence. So things were not chaotic in the school, but really we're all aligned. Parent-teacher relationships in the school. I can't remember all the different. I'm
sure there was a lot of input variables.
Yes, and to try to understand how principal effects were mediated by all of these other school organizational factors, all of which show relationships with school improvement. And then looking at how those were related to classroom instruction and the quality of the classroom environment, and then subsequently to learning gains. So it was really looking at kind of these pathways to see what are the pathways where principals seem to have the most influence that ultimately lead to higher learning gains.
For the learning, were you measuring like test scores, grades?
Yeah, so it depends. We did a whole series of studies that's kind of all were kind of looking, in similar ways, but with different outcomes and different grade levels. Yeah, and so I think they all looked at test score gains, and then some of them also looked at grades when looking at high schools. And we just consistently found that when you compare across schools, the key mediating factor was the climate, whether students felt safe, supported, and challenged. And so we came out saying, really what's really crucial for principals is that they are supporting an environment where, where learning can occur, where students end up feeling safe and supported and challenged. And then in the case studies, we looked at what that actually looks like in schools that are growing. And we also found that teacher leadership was also a key mediator. So basically, the schools that were growing are schools where principals were helping to organize teachers to work together to support a strong climate for teaching and learning. And so when we looked at the case studies and that's what we found quantitatively with the survey data. But, how do you actually do that? And the case study schools, the principals were kind of like the glue in the school. They would like bring teacher teams together. They would provide kind of oversight and direction, maybe even support meetings in some ways. And then teachers would work together to figure out solutions to common problems around their goals for students, right? So figuring out how do we support students to make sure, to get all their work done, or, to be coming to class, or, looking at student data to figure out how do we support, how do we help students who are struggling.
Yeah, it sounds great. So once you found, once the research was conducted and you had your results, how is your results used to kind of impact CPS policy or school leadership as a whole? Did you work with the district in any way to kind of share your findings with other school leaders?
Yeah. So, and then this is where really the district took over. And, for us as researchers, we need partners to make the work useful, because that's not what we do. That's not our expertise. It has to be people that are actually in the field working. And so we had so the district invited us as researchers in to talk to different groups. So, for example, we came in and we talked to all the network chiefs. The network chiefs are they oversee principals. Each network chief oversees a number of school principals. So, for example, we came in, we talked about the research with the network chiefs. And then the district, we produced a 4-pager that was, a short summary. So then the district took, that, and then they had professional learning workshops around it, a couple of different workshops for all the principals in the district. And also, I'm trying to think, it was all the instructional support specialists too. So then the district, they have, ways of doing professional, they have, they'll bring people together for professional learning in different ways. And so then they used that 4-pager and then the case studies that we produced on top of that to, to run professional learning workshops, for all the schools in the district. So that's one thing we do spend a lot of time on, is thinking about, how can we put out the research in a way that it makes it really kind of easy to use. And it's so hard, I have to say, as researchers, because as a researcher, all the different details and things feel so important. And so it's kind of step back and say, okay, what are the key messages, and how do we get those out there? Can be really, it takes a lot of time. And thinking about, a lot of times there'll be like a key figure or infographic that carries the work forward. And, as I have to say, we can have all these great findings. People always only remember one thing from any study. So trying to figure out, what that one key thing is that you want to emphasize can be really challenging.
Yeah. But it sounds like that's another kind of great aspect of the consortium is not only on the front end are you able to easier do the research, but once you have the results, it sounds like it's easier to share that because you already have those relationships with network chiefs and you are practiced in communicating with the school leaders. So that sounds like a kind of a really cool aspect of the consortium.
Well, that's